"Ma'am, I wasn't expecting to find you sitting next to a trash can." The room went completely silent. A moment earlier, people had been laughing. My father had been laughing the loudest. My brother's promotion ceremony was supposed to be the biggest day of his life. Military officers, family friends, local officials, and neighbors had gathered in a banquet hall outside Norfolk, Virginia. The atmosphere had been cheerful, proud, celebratory. Then an admiral walked through the door. Instead of heading toward the stage, he stopped in his tracks and stared directly at me. At the woman sitting beside a trash can. The same woman everyone had spent the last 20 minutes humiliating. I remember the expression on my father's face. Confusion. Then concern. Then something else. Fear. But before I tell you what happened that afternoon, I need to explain how we got there. Because nothing about that moment made sense unless you understood my family. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 42 years old at the time. And for most of my life, I had been the disappointment. At least according to my father. I grew up in a small town outside Richmond, Virginia. My father, Richard Carter, believed strongly in hard work discipline and traditional values. There wasn't anything wrong with that. The problem was that he only seemed to see those qualities in my younger brother, Michael. Michael could do no wrong. If Michael got a B in school, Dad praised him. If I got an A, Dad asked why it wasn't an A+. When Michael made varsity football, Dad celebrated for weeks. When I earned a statewide academic scholarship, Dad barely mentioned it. At first, I thought I simply needed to try harder. Then I got older, and I realized the rules were different. Some children grow up trying to earn love. Others grow up learning they never will. I belonged to the second group. My mother did her best to balance things. She loved both of us, but she passed away from cancer when I was 22. After that, whatever restraint existed inside my father seemed to disappear. Michael became his pride. I became his burden. At 18, I enlisted in the Navy, not because I was running away, because I wanted purpose, structure, service. I wanted to build something that belonged to me. Dad's response still echoed in my memory. "Can't make it in college, so you're joining the military." The disappointment in his voice hurt more than I admitted. I spent years proving him wrong. Or maybe proving myself right. Either way, I stopped seeking his approval. At least that's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated. Part of me never stopped wanting my father to look at me the way he looked at Michael. I just got better at hiding it. Over the next 2 decades, my career took me around the world. Deployments, training commands, disaster relief operations, humanitarian missions, leadership positions. The work mattered. The people mattered. The mission mattered. Recognition never mattered much to me. In fact, I rarely talked about my accomplishments. Partly because military culture teaches humility. Partly because I knew my father wouldn't care anyway. Whenever relatives asked what I did, I usually gave vague answers. "I'm in the Navy." That was enough. Most of them assumed I handled paperwork somewhere. I never corrected them. Life became easier that way. Meanwhile, Michael stayed close to home. He joined public service, built connections, married young, had 2 children, and became the center of every family gathering. Dad loved introducing him. "This is my son." The pride practically glowed from him. I learned to smile through it. Years passed. Then Michael received a significant promotion. A ceremony was scheduled near Norfolk. The entire family was invited. When the invitation arrived, I considered declining. Not because I disliked Michael. Despite everything, I loved my brother. The problem was that family gatherings always left me feeling like an outsider. Still, something told me to go. Maybe loyalty. Maybe curiosity. Maybe hope. Hope has a funny way of surviving long after it should be dead. The banquet hall sat beside a marina overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. It was a beautiful spring afternoon. Sunlight reflected off the water. Flags fluttered in the breeze. People chatted happily in the parking lot. Everything looked picture perfect. When I walked inside, nobody noticed me. That wasn't unusual. I signed the guest book and found my assigned table. Or tried to. My name wasn't there. I checked again. Nothing. Eventually, I found a handwritten place card near the catering station. Beside a large gray trash can. A folding chair. Not a banquet chair. Not a seat at a table. A folding chair. I honestly thought it was a mistake. Then I heard my father's voice. "Oh, there she is." People turned. Dad grinned. The grin told me everything. This wasn't an accident. He had planned it. I walked over calmly. "Dad, is this supposed to be my seat?" Several guests looked uncomfortable. My father laughed. Not a nervous laugh. A deliberate one. The kind meant to entertain an audience. Then he said the words that would change everything. "Trash belongs with trash." The room exploded with laughter. Some people laughed because they agreed. Others laughed because they felt pressured. A few looked horrified. Michael chuckled awkwardly. Not because he thought it was funny, because he didn't want to challenge Dad. That hurt more than I expected. For a brief moment I considered leaving, driving away, never speaking to any of them again. But something stopped me. Maybe dignity, maybe stubbornness, maybe 20 years of military training. Instead I pulled out the chair, sat down, folded my hands, and smiled. The laughter gradually faded. Conversation resumed. Music played. Servers carried trays through the room. Life moved on, at least for everyone else. Inside, old wounds had reopened. Not because of the chair, not because of the trash can. Because a 42-year-old woman suddenly felt like a little girl again. The daughter who never measured up. The daughter nobody saw. I stared out the window toward the marina, breathed slowly, and reminded myself of something important. People can only define your worth if you hand them the power to do it. I had learned that lesson years ago. Still, lessons sometimes need repeating. About 20 minutes later, a strange movement caught my attention outside. Several black government SUVs had entered the parking lot. The vehicles parked near the entrance. Security personnel stepped out. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Guests noticed. Whispers spread. Someone important had arrived. Very important. My father straightened his tie. Michael adjusted his jacket. The master of ceremonies hurried toward the entrance. Everyone assumed the visitor had come to honor my brother. Nobody looked at me. Nobody noticed the small smile forming on my face. Because unlike everyone else in that room, I knew exactly who had just arrived. And I knew the day was about to change forever. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not complete silence. More like a ripple moving through the room. Conversation slowed. Laughter faded. People turned toward the entrance one by one. The banquet hall had been loud all afternoon. Glasses clinked, families chatted, children wandered between tables. The sound of celebration filled every corner. Then the black SUVs arrived, and everything changed. I remained seated beside the trash can. The same folding chair. The same spot my father had chosen for me. Servers continued moving around me carrying trays of iced tea and appetizers. Every now and then someone glanced my way with sympathy. Most quickly looked away. People rarely know what to do when they witness humiliation. My father, meanwhile, was enjoying himself. He stood near the stage, surrounded by relatives and local officials. His chest practically swelled with pride every time someone congratulated Michael. "Your son has done well, Richard." "Thank you." "He should be proud." "Oh, he is?" Dad loved every second of it. Michael stood nearby, shaking hands and accepting congratulations. To his credit, he looked uncomfortable every time his eyes drifted toward my chair. But uncomfortable wasn't the same as courageous. He never came over, never apologized, never offered me a seat. Sometimes silence becomes its own form of participation. Outside, vehicle doors opened. Several uniformed personnel stepped onto the sidewalk. Guests began whispering. "Who is that?" "Must be somebody important." I heard an admiral might attend. My father's eyes lit up. An admiral. For him, that was better than Christmas morning. A high-ranking military officer attending Michael's promotion ceremony would become a story he'd tell for years. The master of ceremonies hurried toward the entrance. Several local officials straightened their jackets. Even Michael looked surprised. Apparently, this guest had not been listed on the official program. I took a slow sip of water and watched. The doors opened. A Navy admiral entered the hall. Tall, distinguished, silver hair, rows of ribbons across his dress uniform. His presence commanded immediate attention, not because he demanded it, because he had earned it. People instinctively stepped aside. Conversation stopped altogether. The admiral nodded politely as he entered. The master of ceremonies approached him immediately. So did several officers. Everyone expected him to move toward the stage, toward Michael, toward the guest of honor. Instead, something unexpected happened. The admiral stopped. Completely stopped. His eyes had found me. For a brief moment, neither of us moved. Then he changed direction and started walking straight toward the trash can. Toward me? I heard confusion spreading through the crowd. People turned to follow his path. Their expressions changed as they realized where he was going, or rather, who he was going to. The admiral crossed the room. One table, then another, until he stood directly in front of me. I slowly rose to my feet, not because protocol required it, because respect goes both ways. He looked at the folding chair, then at the trash can, then at me. His expression hardened. Not with anger toward me, with disbelief toward the situation. Then he spoke. "Ma'am, I wasn't expecting to find you sitting next to a trash can." The room froze. Every conversation died instantly. The words echoed through the hall. People exchanged confused looks. My father blinked. Michael looked stunned. Several officers stared openly. The Admiral wasn't merely speaking politely. He was speaking with genuine respect. The kind reserved for someone important. I smiled. "It's fine, Admiral." He glanced at the chair again. "No, ma'am, it isn't." A nervous laugh escaped someone nearby. Nobody joined in. The atmosphere had completely changed. A few minutes earlier, people had been laughing at me. Now they were trying to understand what they had missed. The Admiral turned toward a nearby staff member. "Please bring another chair." Immediately. No hesitation. Within seconds, employees were rushing to rearrange seating. The speed of their response only added to the confusion. Dad finally stepped forward. "Admiral, sir." The Admiral acknowledged him politely. "Mr. Carter." Dad seemed relieved that the Admiral knew his name. He assumed the attention was still connected to Michael. "My son is being recognized today." "Yes," the Admiral replied. "I understand." The response sounded courteous, but there was something unusual about it. His focus remained on me. Not on Michael, not on Dad, on me. Michael approached carefully. His smile looked forced. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you." The Admiral shook his hand. "Congratulations on your promotion." Michael beamed. For a second, normalcy seemed ready to return. Then the Admiral added something that changed everything again. "I'm sure your sister is proud of you." My brother's smile faded slightly. The Admiral had deliberately redirected attention back to me. Whispers spread across the room. I could almost hear people thinking, "How does he know her?" A new chair arrived. A proper banquet chair. The Admiral personally pulled it out. For me. The room practically stopped breathing. My father looked like he had swallowed a stone. The image alone was shocking. An Admiral standing beside a woman everyone had just mocked, treating her with visible respect, offering her a seat. I sat down. The Admiral took the chair beside me. Not the seat reserved near the stage, not the VIP table. Beside me. Gasps echoed around the room. Dad's face lost color. For the first time all day, he looked uncertain. The Master of Ceremonies hurried over. "Sir, we have a table prepared for you." The Admiral nodded politely. "I'm comfortable here." The room fell silent again, because everyone understood what that meant. The most important guest in attendance had chosen to sit beside the woman next to the trash can. Several military officers entered the hall behind him. Senior officers, decorated officers, men and women with decades of service. As they spotted the Admiral, they approached. Then they noticed me, and their reactions mirrored his. Respect. Recognition. One officer smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, ma'am." Another shook my hand. "It's been too long." A third laughed softly. "I should have known you'd somehow end up stealing the spotlight." The room stared in disbelief. Nobody knew what to say anymore, least of all my father. I could see him replaying the last hour in his head. The joke. The laughter. The chair. The trash can. For the first time, he seemed to realize something was terribly wrong. Not wrong for me. Wrong for him. One of the officers leaned toward another. He thought he was whispering quietly, but in the silence, everyone heard him. "Do they really not know who she is?" The question landed like a grenade. Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. Not yet. And judging by the growing panic on my father's face, the truth was about to become very expensive. For the next several minutes, nobody paid attention to the stage. Nobody cared about the decorations. Nobody cared about the catering. Nobody even cared about Michael's promotion ceremony. The entire room was focused on one question. Who was I? I could almost see it spreading from table to table. The same people who had ignored me an hour earlier were now stealing glances in my direction, whispering, speculating, trying to solve a mystery they hadn't known existed. My father stood frozen near the stage. I had never seen him look so uncertain. Richard Carter was a man who always believed he understood a room. He understood people. He understood status. At least he thought he did. But for the first time in his life, he was completely lost. The Admiral sat beside me calmly. He wasn't trying to create a scene. That was the irony. The scene existed because of how everyone else was reacting. He simply treated me the same way he always had, with professional respect. A server approached nervously. "Would you like anything, Admiral?" He glanced toward me. "Has Commander Carter been served?" The young woman blinked. "Commander." The word spread instantly. "Commander." I heard it bounce across the room like a pebble skipping across water. "Commander Carter." Not Secretary Carter. Not Administrative Assistant Carter. Commander Carter. The server looked at me. I smiled kindly. I'm fine, thank you. She nodded and hurried away. The whispers intensified. Several guests immediately pulled out their phones. Within minutes, people were searching. Searching my name. Searching military records. Searching professional biographies. Searching anything they could find. My father noticed. What are they doing? Nobody answered him. Michael pulled out his own phone. I watched his expression change. Then change again. Then completely disappear. His eyes moved slowly across the screen. He looked up at me. Then back down. Then up again. As though he couldn't believe what he was reading. I understood why. Because for 20 years I had deliberately kept my career private. Whenever relatives asked questions, I changed the subject. Whenever people praised me, I redirected attention elsewhere. I had learned long ago that talking about accomplishments rarely changes people's opinions, especially when those opinions are already fixed. But now the information was everywhere, and nobody could ignore it anymore. The first officer standing nearby finally spoke. "Ma'am, are you still overseeing Atlantic Emergency Response Operations?" I nodded. "Among other responsibilities." The officer smiled. "Your hurricane evacuation protocols saved lives all over the East Coast." Several people overheard him. More whispers. More confused looks. My father looked increasingly uncomfortable. Hurricane evacuations. Emergency response. He had no idea what any of that meant. Truthfully, neither did most people in the room. But they understood one thing. It sounded important. Very important. Michael slowly approached my table. For the first time all afternoon, he looked genuinely nervous. "Evelyn." I looked up. "Yes," his voice was careful. "How long have you been a commander?" The question revealed everything. My own brother didn't know. I gave him a small smile. "Several years." His eyes widened. "Several years. Not several months, not recently. Years." The realization hit him hard. The information hadn't been hidden. He had simply never cared enough to ask. That hurt him. I could see it. Because deep down Michael wasn't cruel. Weak sometimes. Cowardly sometimes. But not cruel. His greatest flaw was allowing our father's opinions to become his own. The Admiral watched quietly. He wasn't enjoying Michael's discomfort. Neither was I. Contrary to what people think, revenge rarely feels as satisfying as imagined. Mostly it feels sad. Sad because the people disappointing you are often the same people you once loved. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. I was 23 years old, fresh off my first deployment. I had returned home after nearly 10 months overseas. Mom had already passed away by then. Dad picked me up at the airport. The ride home lasted almost 2 hours. During those 2 hours, he asked exactly one question about my deployment. One. The rest of the conversation focused on Michael. Michael's new job. Michael's girlfriend. Michael's plans. Michael's future. I remember staring out the passenger window wondering why I kept expecting things to change. That had been nearly 20 years earlier. And somehow I still hadn't fully learned. Back in the present, another officer approached. Then another. Then another. Each greeting made the atmosphere more uncomfortable. Not because they were praising me, because they clearly knew me, respected me, valued me. One senior officer laughed warmly. "Evelyn, I still tell people about that evacuation operation in North Carolina." Several heads turned. "What evacuation?" The officer smiled. 300 civilians trapped during flood conditions." He shook his head. "Most people would have waited for better weather." I immediately interrupted. It wasn't just me. But he ignored the correction. "You made the call." The room listened. Nobody touched their food anymore. Nobody cared about lunch. My father finally stepped forward. His patience had reached its limit. "What exactly is going on here?" The room became quiet. The Admiral looked at him calmly. "There seems to be some confusion." My father forced a laugh. "I think that's fair to say." The Admiral nodded, then spoke carefully. "Your daughter is one of the most respected officers currently serving in her field." My father laughed again. Only this time it sounded nervous, almost desperate. "Come on." Nobody joined his laughter. Nobody. The silence was brutal. The Admiral didn't smile. Neither did the officers. Because none of them considered the statement extraordinary. To them it was simply true. For the first time all day, my father looked genuinely shaken. A few tables away, I noticed several guests reading articles on their phones. One woman covered her mouth. Another stared openly at me. A retired Navy veteran stood slowly from his chair. He had been sitting quietly in the back of the room. Now he looked directly at me. Recognition flashed across his face. I know that name. The room turned toward him. The elderly veteran pointed gently. You were the officer who coordinated relief operations after Hurricane Florence. I nodded. The veteran's eyes softened. My granddaughter was evacuated because of those efforts. Silence. Absolute silence. The old man placed a hand over his heart. Thank you. I didn't know what to say. So I simply nodded. But I noticed something happening nearby. My father's shoulders had begun to sag. The confidence that carried him through the afternoon was disappearing. Because the story he had told himself for years was collapsing. The disappointing daughter. The successful son. The family hierarchy. All of it. Then, before anyone could speak again, the master of ceremonies rushed back onto the stage. His face looked pale. He adjusted the microphone, cleared his throat, and made an announcement nobody expected. Before we continue with today's promotion ceremony, we have been authorized to conduct a special recognition presentation. Confused murmurs filled the room. Michael frowned. My father blinked. The master of ceremonies looked directly at me, then smiled. And the individual being recognized today is Commander Evelyn Carter. The room exploded with shock, and the biggest surprise of the day was still yet to come. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The master of ceremonies stood at the podium holding a folder, while more than 100 guests stared at me. Commander Evelyn Carter. The name seemed to hang in the air. My brother looked stunned. My father looked as if the floor had vanished beneath him. And honestly, part of me wished the ceremony would simply end. I never enjoyed being the center of attention. That might sound strange after everything that happened, but it was true. The Navy had taught me many things over the years. One of them was that real leadership rarely seeks applause. The mission comes first. The people come first. Recognition comes last. Unfortunately, life doesn't always cooperate with our preferences. The master of ceremonies adjusted the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, today's event includes an unexpected but very special recognition. The room remained silent. Everyone was listening now. Every single person. I glanced toward the Admiral. He gave me a reassuring nod. Then he quietly whispered, "You've earned this." I smiled politely. But inside I felt something entirely different. Nervous. Not because of the recognition. Because of my father. A small part of me still worried about what this would do to him. Even after everything. Even after the trash can. Even after the laughter. Children never completely stop caring what their parents think. The master of ceremonies continued. Commander Evelyn Carter has spent more than 2 decades serving the United States Navy with distinction. Several large monitors positioned around the room suddenly came to life. A slideshow appeared. The first photograph showed me at 20 years old. Young. Thin. Standing awkwardly beside a training instructor. A few relatives gasped. Many had never seen the picture. The second photo appeared. Then the third. Then dozens more. Deployments. Command centers. Disaster response operations. Humanitarian missions. Rescue efforts. Military ceremonies. Places my family had never asked about. Places I had never talked about. The room watched quietly. The master of ceremonies read from the official record. Commander Carter has led multiple large-scale emergency response operations throughout the Atlantic region. Another image appeared. Floodwaters. Rescue helicopters. Emergency shelters. The room grew even quieter. She has coordinated evacuation efforts involving thousands of civilians during hurricanes and natural disasters. My father stared at the screen. His expression changed with every photograph. I could almost see the memories forming inside his head. The birthdays he missed. The phone calls he rushed through. The conversations he never had. Years he never bothered to understand. The presenter continued. Her leadership during several emergency operations has been recognized at both regional and national levels. The audience applauded softly. I wished they wouldn't. Recognition always feels strange when so many people contributed. No operation is ever accomplished alone. No mission belongs to one person. But there was no stopping the ceremony now. A video began playing. Several military personnel appeared on screen. One by one they spoke. A senior chief described a hurricane evacuation. A Coast Guard officer discussed joint rescue operations. A civilian emergency coordinator talked about disaster relief efforts. None of them spoke about medals. None of them spoke about rank. They talked about people, families, lives saved, communities protected, the things that actually mattered. As the video played, I noticed something happening at my father's table. Nobody was speaking to him anymore. Not because they were angry, because they were processing. Many had laughed earlier. Now they were realizing exactly who they had laughed at. Across the room, Michael sat completely still. His eyes never left the screen. Then came the moment I hadn't expected. A sailor appeared in the video. Young. Probably 22. Maybe 23. He looked directly into the camera. I was a brand new officer when I first worked under Commander Carter. He smiled. I thought leadership meant being the smartest person in the room. Several guests chuckled. The young officer continued. She taught me that leadership means taking responsibility when things go wrong and giving credit away when things go right. I looked down, embarrassed. The room listened carefully. The young man smiled again. Everything I know about taking care of people came from her. The video ended. The applause this time was louder. Much louder. I wished my mother could have seen it. Not the recognition. The respect. She would have been proud. The master of ceremonies stepped away from the podium. Then something unexpected happened. 3 senior officers approached the stage. Each carried a folder. One carried a presentation case. The audience immediately sensed this wasn't routine. The first officer began speaking. He described a recent operation. An operation that had never appeared in the news. Most military work doesn't. A dangerous situation. Complicated logistics. Lives at risk. The details remained limited for security reasons. But the outcome was clear. A serious disaster had been prevented. The officer paused. Commander Carter's leadership was instrumental in the success of that mission. Then another officer spoke. Then another. Each described my work. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Professionally. Respectfully. The effect was overwhelming. Because these were not compliments from family. Not favors. Not politics. These were assessments from people who had spent decades judging performance, and they all reached the same conclusion. I had done my job well. Very well. When the final speaker finished, the room rose to its feet, a standing ovation. I honestly didn't know where to look. My face felt warm. My hands trembled slightly. Not from pride. From emotion. Because for the first time in my life, I was standing in front of my family exactly as I was. Not underestimated. Not dismissed. Not ignored. Simply seen. Then came the biggest misunderstanding of the afternoon. One of the local officials leaned toward another guest. His whisper carried farther than he intended. Well, now we know why the Admiral is here. Several people nodded. They assumed the answer was obvious. I heard another whisper. She's his wife. More nods. The room seemed relieved. The mystery had been solved. Or so they thought. The Admiral slowly stood. He approached the podium. The audience immediately quieted. He looked across the room, then directly at my father. My wife is indeed seated in this room today. Several guests smiled knowingly. The Admiral continued. But I would like to correct a misunderstanding. The smiles disappeared. His voice remained calm, measured, professional. I am not here because Commander Carter is married to me. The room froze. You could have heard a pin drop. The Admiral glanced toward me, then back toward the audience. I am here because I have spent years watching one of the finest officers I have ever known serve her country with extraordinary integrity. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Admiral's next words landed like thunder. I respect her because she earned it. My father's face turned white, completely white, and for the first time all afternoon I saw genuine shame in his eyes. Not embarrassment, not discomfort, shame. Because suddenly he understood something devastating. Everything he admired in Michael, everything he celebrated, everything he valued, his daughter had achieved in abundance. And he had never even bothered to look. A few minutes later, while the applause continued around the room, I noticed movement near the exit. My father was quietly walking away, alone, head lowered, shoulders slumped. No one stopped him. No one called after him. He disappeared through the doors without saying a word. And for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Watching him leave hurt far more than watching him laugh. The applause continued long after my father left the room. People shook my hand. Military officers offered congratulations. Former colleagues shared stories. Guests who had ignored me all afternoon suddenly wanted to talk. But my attention kept drifting toward the exit, toward the door my father had walked through. The truth was, I hadn't come to the ceremony hoping for revenge. I know that's probably hard to believe. Especially after everything that happened. The trash can. The joke. The laughter. The humiliation. But revenge had never been my goal. If it had been, I would have revealed my career years ago. I would have corrected people. I would have demanded recognition. Instead, I spent most of my adult life doing the opposite. Keeping quiet. Moving forward. Building a life without waiting for my family's approval. At least that was what I told myself. Yet, as I stood there accepting congratulations, I realized something uncomfortable. Part of me had never stopped hoping. Hoping my father would someday see me. Not Commander Carter. Not the officer. Not the decorated veteran. Just his daughter. The daughter he had overlooked for most of her life. The ceremony ended about an hour later. Guests gradually departed. Tables emptied. The banquet hall grew quieter. The Admiral and I lingered behind, speaking with a few officers. Eventually, Michael approached. He looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. There were dark circles beneath his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. "I'm sorry." Simple words, but sincere. I could hear it. I looked at him carefully. "For what?" He swallowed. "For a lot of things." His eyes dropped toward the floor. "I should have said something when Dad put you beside the trash can." I remained silent. He continued. "I should have said something years ago." That one hurt. Because it was true. Not just today. Years. Decades. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. "I always knew he treated us differently." His voice grew quieter. "I just didn't want to admit it." There it was. The truth. Not cruelty. Cowardice. A different problem. But still a problem. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying it." He looked relieved. Not forgiven, just relieved. As though carrying that truth had become exhausting. Then he asked a question. One I'd never expected. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" I smiled sadly. "Tell you what?" "Any of it," he gestured vaguely. "The Navy, the promotions, the operations, everything." I thought about that. The answer wasn't simple. Finally, I shrugged. Nobody ever asked. Michael looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. Because he knew it was true. Nobody had asked. Not really. Not in a meaningful way. The conversation ended there. Neither of us knew what else to say. Some wounds require more than one afternoon to heal. That evening, I drove alone to a small cemetery outside Richmond. The sun was beginning to set. The air felt cool, peaceful. I parked near the entrance and carried a small bouquet of flowers. My mother's grave sat beneath a large oak tree, the same tree she loved when she was alive. I placed the flowers beside the headstone, then sat quietly. For a long time, I simply stared at her name. The years disappear in places like that. You stop feeling 42. You stop feeling important. You stop feeling successful. You become a child again. A daughter. Someone who misses her mother. "I wish you'd been there today." The words escaped before I realized I had spoken them aloud. A breeze moved through the trees. Leaves rustled softly overhead. I smiled. Mom would have known exactly what to say. She always did. The Admiral arrived a few minutes later. He found me sitting on the grass. Neither of us spoke immediately. After all these years together, silence had become comfortable. Eventually, he sat beside me. "You okay?" I nodded. Then shook my head. Then laughed softly. "Maybe," he smiled. "That's honest." We sat quietly, watching the sunset, listening to birds settle into the trees. Finally, I told him what I had been thinking. I thought today would feel better. He understood immediately. The ceremony, the reveal. The Admiral nodded. I continued. I thought maybe it would fix something. His expression softened. But it didn't. I looked toward my mother's grave. "No." He waited. Patient as always. Eventually, I found the words. I spent years thinking that if my father finally saw what I'd accomplished, everything would make sense. The Admiral sighed gently. "And now," I smiled sadly, "now I know it doesn't work that way." He placed a hand over mine. No accomplishment heals an old wound by itself. That was one of the reasons I loved him. He never offered easy answers. Only honest ones. The next morning, my father sat alone in his house. I didn't know it then, but Michael would later tell me what happened. After returning home, Dad couldn't sleep. He wandered through old boxes stored in the attic. Photographs, documents, memories. Eventually, he found something he hadn't seen in years. A small cardboard box labeled Evelyn. Inside were letters, dozens of them. Letters I had written throughout my career. Letters I never mailed. Most were written during deployments. Lonely nights. Long missions. Difficult assignments. Not official reports. Personal thoughts. The things a daughter wishes she could tell her father. In one letter, I described missing home. In another, I talked about wishing Mom were still alive. In another, I admitted something I had never said aloud. I wanted Dad to be proud of me. Apparently, he read every single one after another, hour after hour, alone. By sunrise, he was crying. Michael told me later it was the first time he had ever seen our father cry. Not when Mom died. Not during hardships. Not during failures. Never. But that morning he did. Because for the first time he wasn't looking at rank, or achievements, or promotions. He was looking at the lonely little girl hidden behind all of them, and finally seeing her. The next morning shortly after breakfast, there was a knock on my hotel room door. I opened it. My father stood outside. His eyes were red. His shoulders looked older, smaller somehow. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "Evelyn, could we talk?" And for the first time in my life, I heard humility in his voice. For a few seconds, I simply stared at him. The man standing outside my hotel room barely resembled the father I had known most of my life. The Richard Carter I grew up with always seemed larger than life. Confident, opinionated, certain. Certain he was right. Certain he understood people. Certain he knew what mattered. The man standing before me now looked tired. Not physically tired. Soul tired, as though something heavy had finally caught up with him. "Evelyn, could we talk?" His voice was quiet. Careful. Almost fragile. I stepped aside. "Come in." He entered slowly. The room suddenly felt very small. I sat near the window. He chose the chair across from me. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't hostile. It was simply crowded with 40 years of unfinished conversations. Finally, my father took a deep breath. "I don't know where to start." I looked at him. "Then start with the truth." He nodded. A slow, painful nod. Then he surprised me. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame stress. He didn't blame grief. He didn't blame my mother's death. He didn't blame anyone. Instead, he looked directly at me and said, "I failed you." The words hung in the air. Simple. Honest. Devastating. My father swallowed hard. "I failed you as a father." Tears filled his eyes. "I've been sitting with that all night." I remained silent. Not because I was angry. Because I needed to hear everything. For once. The whole truth. "I spent years convincing myself I was treating you fairly." His voice cracked. "But I wasn't." He shook his head. "I favored Michael." Another pause. "I always favored Michael." The honesty hurt. But strangely, it also brought relief. There is something powerful about hearing a truth finally spoken aloud. Especially one you've carried alone for decades. Dad continued. "I don't even know when it started." He stared down at his hands. "Maybe because he reminded me of myself." He laughed bitterly. "Maybe because I understood him better." Another pause. "Maybe because I was blind." I watched him carefully. For the first time in my life, I wasn't seeing my father defend himself. I was watching him confront himself. And those are very different things. His eyes lifted toward mine. "When your mother died, I got worse." I nodded slowly. We both knew it. Neither of us had ever said it, but we both knew. I poured everything into Michael. His voice grew softer. "And I assumed you'd be okay." A tear rolled down his cheek. "I thought you were strong enough not to need me." That one hit hard. Because it explained so much. Not everything, but enough. Many people mistake strength for invulnerability. They see the child who survives, the child who adapts, the child who carries on, and they assume that child doesn't hurt. But strength doesn't eliminate pain. It simply hides it. My father wiped his eyes. Then he said something I never expected. "I read your letters." I froze. The letters. For a moment I couldn't speak. He nodded. "Every one of them." His voice broke completely. "I should have read them years ago." I looked away, suddenly afraid I might cry too. Those letters contained parts of me nobody had ever seen. Fear, loneliness, hope, heartbreak. The things I never said out loud. My father shook his head. "You kept reaching for me." Another tear. "And I wasn't there." The room fell silent again. Outside traffic moved along the street below. Inside time seemed to stop. Eventually I asked the question that mattered most. "Why?" Dad looked confused. "Why what?" "Why was I never enough?" The words escaped before I could stop them. 40 years. One question. His face collapsed. The answer came immediately. "No." He shook his head desperately. "No, Evelyn?" More tears. "You were always enough." I stared at him. He continued. "The problem wasn't you." Another pause. "It was me." The room became very quiet. Because deep down I think both of us had waited decades for those words. "The problem wasn't you. Not every wound can be healed." But some wounds finally stopped bleeding. A few minutes later, another knock sounded at the door. "Michael." I opened it. He looked nervous, almost as nervous as Dad. When he entered and saw our father crying, his expression changed immediately. The three of us sat together, awkwardly at first. Then, honestly, for the next hour we talked. Really talked. Maybe for the first time in our lives. Michael admitted things too. He admitted he enjoyed being the favorite. He admitted he stayed silent when he should have spoken. He admitted he sometimes accepted praise that belonged to both of us. None of it was easy. None of it erased the past. But it mattered. Because healing begins where honesty begins. Eventually, Michael looked at me and said, "I don't want to lose my sister." I smiled through tears. "Then don't." That simple. That complicated. By noon, something had changed. Not perfectly. Not magically. But genuinely, the walls we'd spent decades building had begun to crack. A few months later, another family gathering took place. Nothing formal. No ceremonies. No promotions. No speeches. Just a Sunday dinner. The kind families have every day across America. When I arrived, my father met me at the door. He hugged me, then led me inside. There beside his chair was a place setting. My place setting. He smiled. "Saved you a seat." Such a small gesture. Most people would never notice. But I did. Because all those years ago I had wanted a seat at the table. Not because of status, not because of recognition. Because I wanted to belong. And finally I did. Not because I became successful. Not because I earned medals. Not because an admiral defended me. But because the truth finally entered the room. And once the truth arrives, healing becomes possible. Looking back now, the greatest victory wasn't watching my father feel embarrassed. It wasn't seeing guests shocked. It wasn't hearing applause. The greatest victory was discovering that revenge doesn't always mean destroying someone. Sometimes it means allowing them to see what they've done, and giving them the chance to become better. My father can never give me back the years we lost. Neither of us can change the past, but we can choose what happens next. And sometimes that's enough. If there's one lesson I hope you take from my story, it's this. Never assume you know someone's worth based on where they're sitting. You never know what battles they've fought. You never know what sacrifices they've made. And you never know how deeply a kind word or a cruel one can stay with them for a lifetime. If this story touched your heart, take a moment today to reach out to someone you love. Tell them what they mean to you while you still can. And if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten, remember this. Your value has never depended on someone else's ability to recognize it. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if stories like this remind you of the things that truly matter, family forgiveness and second chances, I hope you'll share the story with someone who may need to hear it. The courtroom went so quiet I could hear the old ceiling fan clicking above the judge's bench. "She's an imposter," my brother shouted in court. Then a federal agent placed a sealed envelope on the judge's desk. His eyes widened. "Put him in cuffs." My father's face went pale. "Wait, what?" For a moment nobody moved. Not the bailiff, not the lawyers, not even the judge. The entire courtroom in Norfolk County seemed frozen in place like one of those old photographs my mother used to keep in dusty albums upstairs. The only sound came from my brother Daniel's breathing. Fast, uneven, panicked. Then the bailiff stepped forward. "Sir, stand up and place your hands behind your back." Daniel blinked like he hadn't heard correctly. "What? No, this is insane. She's the liar. She's the one." "Now, sir." The handcuffs clicked loudly enough to echo against the wooden walls. I sat perfectly still at the defense table, my hands folded in my lap. 30 years in the Navy had taught me something important. Panic spreads quickly. Calm spreads slower, but it lasts longer. My father stood halfway from his chair in the gallery, gripping the wooden bench so tightly his knuckles turned white. "There's been a mistake," he said shakily. "My son didn't do anything." The federal agent didn't even look at him. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes before turning toward me. "Commander Evelyn Brooks," he said carefully, "why was this court not informed of your federal status earlier?" I answered quietly. "Because I was trying to keep this a family matter, Your Honor." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Family," he snapped. "You disappeared for 30 years. That one landed harder than I expected. Not because it was true. Because part of me had spent most of my life afraid it was." The judge ordered a recess. People immediately began whispering around the courtroom. Norfolk wasn't a large enough city for scandals like this to stay quiet long, especially not ones involving federal investigators and military records. I stayed seated while my attorney Linda Carver leaned closer to me. "You all right?" "I've been better." She gave me a small nod. Linda was around my age, late 50s, sharp as a tack with silver hair she refused to dye. She'd spent 20 years handling military family cases around coastal Virginia. "You understand this changes everything now," she said. "I know. You still want to keep the financial records sealed from the press." I looked over toward my father. Frank Brooks, 79 years old, Korean War veteran's son, worked 42 years at the shipyard before retirement. Proud man, hard man. And at that moment he looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. "Yes," I told her softly, "no matter what Daniel did, he's still my father's son." Linda studied me for a second like she was trying to understand something. Then she sighed. "You Navy people are built different." I almost smiled at that. Almost. Across the room, Daniel was arguing loudly with the federal marshals, while another man in a dark suit opened a thick file folder. The sealed envelope sat on the judge's bench like a live grenade. That envelope had changed everything in less than 60 seconds. And the strange thing was, I never wanted it opened in the first place. 3 months earlier, if someone had told me I'd be sitting in a Virginia courtroom while my own brother got arrested for fraud connected to my Navy records, I would have laughed in their face. Back then, my biggest concern had been retirement. I'd retired from the Navy the previous fall after 30 years of service. Commander Evelyn Brooks, logistics and operations support, nothing glamorous, no movie-worthy stories. Mostly long deployments, paperwork, classified transport coordination, and years spent helping younger sailors survive careers that could swallow whole marriages and families. I rented a modest condo near Chesapeake Bay after retirement. Quiet place, good fishing nearby, older neighbors who minded their business. For the first time in decades, life had slowed down. Then my mother died. That phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Daniel called me from Norfolk General Hospital. "You better come now," he said flatly, "if you even care." No hello. No warning. Just that. I remember staring out my kitchen window at the rain running down the glass while my coffee turned cold beside me. When did it happen? About an hour ago. I closed my eyes. What about Dad? He's devastated. There was accusation tucked inside every word he spoke. There always had been. "I'll be there tonight," I said. "You should have come sooner." Then he hung up. That was Daniel. My younger brother had a gift for making every conversation feel like a trial. By the time I arrived at my parents' house the next evening, casseroles already lined the kitchen counters. Church friends filled the living room, speaking in hushed voices, while old country music played softly from the radio. My father barely looked at me when I walked in. "You made it," he said. "Not good to see you." "Not your mother missed you." Just that. "You made it." I hugged him anyway. His body felt fragile beneath his flannel shirt. Daniel stood near the dining room holding court like he owned the place. He shook hands, accepted condolences, told stories about helping Mom through her final weeks. If you listened long enough, you'd think he'd carried the whole family alone. And maybe in some ways he believed he had. "Evelyn." I turned and saw my Aunt Ruth pulling me into a hug. "You look tired, sweetheart." I drove straight through. "She talked about you all the time," Ruth whispered. That caught me off guard. She did. "Oh, honey, constantly." Before I could answer, Daniel walked over holding 2 cups of coffee. "1 cream, no sugar," he said, handing me one. I stared at it for a second. He remembered. After all these years, he still remembered how I took my coffee. "Thanks," I said quietly. For one brief moment, standing there in my parents' kitchen with rain tapping against the windows and mourners speaking softly nearby, I thought maybe grief had changed us. Maybe losing Mom had finally stripped away decades of resentment. Maybe we could still become a family before it was too late. I had no idea then that my brother had already stolen nearly everything my mother left behind. And I certainly had no idea the federal government was about to enter our lives. When people ask me today whether favoritism can destroy a family, I tell them this. It rarely destroys a family all at once. It happens slowly, quietly, like rust underneath an old truck. By the time you finally see the damage, the whole frame is already cracked underneath. That was my family. And looking back now, I think my mother spent most of her life trying to hold together two men who never truly understood each other, my father and my brother. I was simply the person standing between them. I grew up in Norfolk, Virginia, back when the shipyards still ruled everything. My father, Frank Brooks, worked maintenance at Norfolk Naval Shipyard 6 days a week. He believed in hard work, country music, black coffee, and keeping your feelings to yourself. He also believed boys mattered more. Not cruelly, not openly. Men of his generation rarely said things outright. It showed up in smaller ways. Daniel got praised for effort. I got criticized for results. If Daniel brought home a C in math, Dad slapped him on the back and said, "Well, at least you tried." If I brought home an A-, he'd ask why it wasn't an A. That was simply the weather system inside our house. You stopped questioning it after a while. My mother Lorraine tried her best to balance things. She'd sneak encouragement into ordinary moments while washing dishes or folding laundry. "You're steady," she used to tell me. "People trust steady." At the time, I didn't understand how valuable those words would become. Daniel was 3 years younger than me, and born with the kind of charm that fills a room before a person even speaks. Teachers loved him, girls loved him, coaches loved him. Dad adored him. And honestly, for a long time I did too. When we were children, Daniel followed me everywhere. We built forts behind the garage, rode bicycles until the streetlights came on, shared comic books and peanut butter sandwiches during summer storms. But something shifted when we became teenagers. Maybe it was because I stopped trying to please people. Or maybe Daniel noticed before I did that our father measured worth differently between sons and daughters. Either way, the distance started growing early. I remember one particular night during my senior year of high school. Dad had come home exhausted from work. His back hurt constantly by then, though he never admitted it. Daniel had just made varsity baseball. The whole dinner table revolved around him. Mom cooked pot roast, Dad talked baseball statistics. Daniel laughed and replayed every moment from practice. I mostly listened. Then Dad looked over at me. "So," he said, cutting into his meat, "you finally decide what college you're applying to." I set down my fork. "I'm not going to college." The room went quiet. Mom looked up first. "What do you mean?" "I talked to a Navy recruiter today." Dad actually laughed. Not a happy laugh. The kind adults use when they think someone said something foolish. "The Navy." "Yes, sir." "For what secretarial work?" I swallowed hard. "No, sir, logistics operations." Daniel smirked. "You get seasick riding ferries." I was 12. Dad leaned back in his chair slowly. "You're serious about this?" "I am." He stared at me for several seconds before shaking his head. "I don't understand girls these days." "Girls. Not women. Not daughters. Girls." Mom tried to smooth things over. "Frank, the military can be a good opportunity." "For boys," he interrupted. I still remember the heat rising into my face. "With respect, Dad, women serve too. Not in combat." "I didn't say combat." "You know what I mean." The conversation ended there, but something permanent changed in the room that night. For the first time in my life, I realized my father had already decided who I was allowed to become. And I realized something else too. I wasn't going to ask permission anymore. 3 months later, I left for boot camp. Mom cried at the bus station. Dad shook my hand like I was a distant neighbor. Daniel didn't come at all. The Navy changed me fast. Not because it made me tougher, because it made me quieter. There's something about military life civilians don't fully understand unless they've lived beside it. The constant movement, the uncertainty, the way entire years disappear while everyone back home keeps aging without you. You miss funerals, birthdays, anniversaries. Your parents get older in photographs instead of in front of your eyes. And every time you come home, the world feels slightly unfamiliar. Especially for women in the service back then. People today forget how difficult it could be during the 80s and 90s. You had to prove competence constantly. One mistake followed you forever. Men could be difficult and still respected. Women had to be nearly flawless. I learned quickly that emotions were dangerous in professional spaces. So I became disciplined instead. Reliable. Steady. Exactly what my mother always said. Over time, promotions came, then overseas assignments, then classified operational support work I rarely discussed even with family. Every Christmas I mailed gifts home. Every birthday I called. And every conversation with Dad lasted under 5 minutes. How's work? Fine. You staying safe? Yes, sir. Well, good. Click. Meanwhile, Daniel stayed in Norfolk. He bounced between jobs for years, auto sales, roofing a failed landscaping business. But somehow Dad always described him as finding his footing. By his 40s, Daniel had become the kind of man who always needed rescuing financially, while somehow remaining everyone else's favorite. And my mother kept rescuing him. Car payments. Rent. Credit cards. Little emergencies that never seemed to end. I helped too, though, quietly. When Dad's arthritis surgeries got expensive, I wired money. When Mom needed home repairs, I paid anonymously through a contractor friend. I never told them. Not because I wanted credit. Because I already knew who would receive it. Daniel. Your brother's been helping us so much lately, Mom would say warmly on the phone. And I would simply answer, I'm glad. That became my role in the family. The distant daughter. The dependable wallet. The woman nobody fully understood. Then came the phone call about Mom's stroke. And for the first time in decades, I came home planning to stay longer than a weekend. I truly believed grief might heal us. Instead, grief exposed everything that had been rotting underneath for years. Especially my brother. My mother's funeral took place on a gray Saturday morning, under low coastal clouds that threatened rain but never quite delivered it. That felt appropriate somehow. Everything in our family had always hovered on the edge of something heavier. The church sat only 15 minutes from the naval shipyard where my father had spent most of his adult life. Red brick, white steeple, narrow stained glass windows that turned sunlight blue and gold across the pews. I arrived early wearing a simple black dress and my old pearl earrings, the ones Mom gave me before my first overseas deployment. You should have something beautiful when you travel, she'd said. I touched those earrings 3 times before entering the church. Old habit. Navy life teaches you rituals for calming nerves. Inside, Daniel already stood near the front greeting people like a politician during campaign season. His tie was perfect. His smile practiced. His voice carried just enough grief to sound convincing. There she is, he announced when he saw me. My sister finally made it. A few heads turned. That word finally hung in the air on purpose. I ignored it. I came as fast as I could. Well, he said with a shrug, Mom waited a long time. Same smile. Same knife underneath. I glanced toward my father sitting alone in the front pew. He looked smaller every time I saw him now. His shoulders rounded, his hands spotted with age. Grief had hollowed out his face in only a few days. I sat beside him quietly. Morning, Dad. He nodded without looking at me. You speak with the pastor yet? Last night. That's good. Then silence again. I used to think silence meant peace when I was younger. Now I understood silence could also mean exhaustion. The service itself was beautiful. Simple, honest, exactly what my mother would have wanted. Pastor Green spoke about kindness, patience, and quiet service to others. He mentioned Mom volunteering at church suppers, organizing donation drives, helping military wives while their husbands deployed. Then he said something that caught me off guard. Lorraine Brooks spent her life making people feel less alone. I nearly broke right there. Because it was true. Mom had spent decades cushioning sharp edges inside our family, smoothing arguments, excusing behavior, filling emotional holes before anyone else noticed them. And now she was gone. After the burial, everyone gathered back at the house for food and coffee. The same little ranch-style home where I'd grown up. Nothing inside had changed much. Same wallpaper, same squeaky kitchen floor, same faint smell of cigarette smoke trapped inside curtains from 20 years ago. Only now the house felt strangely unprotected. Like the person holding it together had finally let go. Church friends filled the dining room carrying casseroles and pies, while old family acquaintances approached me one after another. Your mother was proud of you. She kept your Navy photos on the mantle. She talked about you constantly. Every single comment surprised me. Because my father rarely talked about my career at all. Neither did Daniel. Over time, I'd started assuming my mother didn't either. But apparently she had. Constantly. That realization sat heavy in my chest all afternoon. At one point, I stepped into the hallway to catch my breath and noticed Daniel coming downstairs from my parents' bedroom carrying a small metal lockbox. He froze when he saw me. "What's that?" "Paperwork." "For what?" "Estate stuff." I frowned slightly. "Already." He gave me an irritated look. "Somebody has to handle things, Evelyn." The way he said my name always sounded like criticism. "I can help. I've been helping for years." There it was again. That resentment. Not loud. Just simmering beneath everything. Before I could answer, he brushed past me toward the kitchen carrying the box. Something about the interaction stayed with me. Not because of the lockbox itself. Because Daniel looked nervous. That evening, after most guests left, I sat alone on the back porch, watching dusk settle over the neighborhood. The air smelled like wet grass and salt from the bay. Dad eventually stepped outside holding 2 beers. Without speaking, he handed me one. We sat quietly for several minutes. Finally, he said, "Your mother hated when you two fought." I stared out into the yard. "We barely talk enough to fight." "That's not true." "No." He sighed heavily. "You always judged your brother." I actually laughed softly at that. Daniel's 55 years old. So somebody should have expected responsibility from him by now. Dad's expression hardened immediately. He stayed. There it was. The real issue. Not money. Not arguments. Not old resentment. I left. That was the unforgivable thing. He stayed with you and Mom-Dad continued. He handled doctors' medications, hospital visits. And I sent money every month. He looked surprised. "What?" I took a slow sip of beer. "For years." "No, you didn't." "Yes, I did." Dad shook his head instantly. "Daniel helped with expenses. Daniel transferred the payments." The silence afterward felt different. Uncomfortable. Confused. Dad stared out toward the yard for several long seconds. "Well," he muttered, "finally he never said that." Of course he didn't. I almost explained everything then. The mortgage payments. The repair bills. The medical expenses. But I stopped myself. Because deep down I already understood something painful. Dad didn't really want the truth. He wanted the version of the family that made him comfortable. And Daniel had spent years building exactly that version for him. The next morning I woke early and started helping clean the house. While organizing kitchen paperwork, I noticed several overdue notices tucked beneath a pile of magazines. Electric bills. Insurance warnings. Past due pharmacy balances. That made no sense. I knew how much money I'd been sending. Later that afternoon, while Dad napped in his recliner, I quietly asked Mom's longtime friend Gloria if things had been difficult financially. Gloria hesitated. Then she lowered her voice. "Your mother was worried near the end." "About what?" "She thought somebody was moving money around." Cold spread through my stomach. "What do you mean?" Gloria looked toward the living room. She didn't trust some of the papers Daniel had her signing. I felt suddenly wide awake. "What papers?" She didn't say exactly. "When was this?" "Maybe 6 months ago." My pulse started pounding slowly. Not panic. Training. Focus. There's a moment during Navy operations when your instincts quietly tell you something underneath the surface is wrong. I'd learned never to ignore that feeling. That night after Dad went to bed, I searched through the kitchen file cabinet looking for insurance documents. Instead, I found missing bank statements, withdrawal slips, property transfer paperwork, and one signature that made my blood run cold. My mother's name. Signed shakily. Dated 3 days after her stroke. I stared at the page for a long time. Then I turned to the final section. Witnessed by Daniel Brooks. Suddenly the hallway light flipped on. Daniel stood there. His expression changed instantly when he saw the papers in my hands. "You shouldn't be going through that." I stood slowly. "What is this?" "Legal paperwork." She signed this after the stroke. So, she could barely speak. His jaw tightened. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "How much did you take?" The question hit him harder than I expected. Not outrage. Fear. Real fear. Then his face hardened. You know what your problem is, Evelyn? I said nothing. You disappear for decades and come back acting like some damn hero. I asked you a question, and I'm tired of answering to you. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Mom knew who actually stayed around here. I looked down again at the shaking signature on the paper. For the first time in my life, I realized my brother might not simply be selfish. He might actually be dangerous. I didn't sleep much after finding those papers. The old house creaked all night, the way older homes do near the coast pipes, knocking softly floorboards, settling wind brushing against siding worn down by decades of salt air. Every sound seemed louder because my mind refused to quiet down. I sat at the kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m, staring at copies of withdrawal slips and transfer forms. Something wasn't right. And deep down, I think I already knew it was bigger than ordinary greed. At 6:30 the next morning, I brewed coffee while watching the sunrise through the curtains above the sink. Mom used to stand in that exact spot every morning humming Patsy Cline songs while packing Dad's lunchbox. The memory hit harder than expected. Grief works that way at our age. It doesn't arrive dramatically anymore. It sneaks up quietly in ordinary moments. The scrape of a chair. A familiar perfume. An empty room that still feels occupied. I heard Dad shuffling down the hallway before I saw him. "You're up early," he muttered. "Couldn't sleep." He poured himself coffee and lowered into his chair, carefully wincing from arthritis. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then I slid one of the bank statements across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "You tell me." He adjusted his glasses. I watched confusion slowly spread across his face. "This account had $30,000 in it last year," I said quietly. "Now it's almost empty." Dad frowned. "Your mother handled savings." "Did she?" He looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" I reached for another document. "These transfers started after her stroke." He stared at the paperwork silently. "That can't be right." "It is." His face tightened immediately. "You accusing your brother of something?" "I'm asking questions." "You've been home 3 days." "And in 3 days I found missing money." Dad pushed the papers away angrily. "You always think the worst of him." That sentence settled over the kitchen like old smoke. "Always." "Not sometimes." "Always." I leaned back slowly. "Dad, when was the last time you actually reviewed your accounts yourself?" His silence answered for him. That scared me more than the missing money. Older parents trust familiarity, especially fathers like mine. Men raised believing family loyalty mattered more than paperwork. Daniel understood that. And if I was right, he'd been exploiting it for years. Around noon, I drove to the bank branch listed on the statements. The manager, a woman named Cynthia Harper, recognized my last name immediately. "Oh, your mother was lovely," she said warmly. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you." I explained that I was helping organize estate paperwork and needed clarification on several recent transfers. The second she reviewed the account activity, her expression changed slightly. Not alarm. Caution. "I'm afraid I can't discuss certain details without legal authorization." That answer told me plenty already. I handed over my identification. "Retired Navy commander." "Executor inquiry paperwork from my attorney." Cynthia studied everything carefully before lowering her voice. Mrs. Brooks came in several times before her stroke, expressing concerns. Ice slid down my spine. "What kind of concerns?" "She believed someone was pressuring her financially." "Did she say who?" Cynthia hesitated too long. That was answer enough. "Were these signatures verified?" "Some were signed electronically. My mother barely used email." Again that hesitation. Then Cynthia finally said the sentence that changed everything. "There may already be a pending review." I stared at her. "A review by who?" "I'm not authorized to discuss that." Military training teaches you how to read people under pressure. And at that moment, Cynthia Harper looked genuinely nervous. Not about me. About the situation itself. I left the bank and immediately called Linda Carver. She listened quietly while I explained everything. When I finished, she asked only one question. "Do you trust your brother?" "Number. Do you trust your father?" The question caught me off guard. With what? The truth. I looked out across the parking lot toward the gray Chesapeake sky. I don't know anymore. Linda sighed softly. Come see me tomorrow morning. The next 48 hours unraveled fast. Linda's office overlooked downtown Norfolk, only a few blocks from the waterfront. Framed Navy photographs lined her walls beside degrees and legal certificates. After reviewing the documents, she sat back slowly. This isn't simple inheritance fraud. What do you mean? She tapped one form carefully. These account numbers connect to federal survivor benefit deposits. I frowned. Military benefits. Yes. My stomach tightened immediately. After my mother's health declined several years earlier, I'd arranged additional survivor assistance connected to certain classified service compensation programs. Legal, approved, quiet. Very quiet. Only limited people even knew those funds existed. Including Daniel. How bad is this? I asked. Linda removed her glasses. If someone redirected federal military-related payments using forged authorization, she paused. Potentially very bad. The room suddenly felt smaller. What happens now? We investigate carefully. But somebody else was already investigating. I discovered that 3 days later. I was helping Dad sort through garage shelves when a dark sedan pulled into the driveway. 2 men stepped out. One wore a plain suit. The other wore navy dress whites. Dad stiffened immediately. Who the hell is that? The uniformed officer approached calmly. Commander Evelyn Brooks. Yes. He handed me identification. Special Agent Marcus Hale. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. NCIS. Dad looked utterly confused. What's this about? Agent Hale remained professional but respectful. We've been attempting to contact Commander Brooks regarding irregular access tied to military benefit records. Daniel walked out from inside the house, right then carrying a beer. The second he saw the agents, all color drained from his face. That reaction told me everything. Mr. Brooks, Agent Hale said evenly, we'd like to ask you several questions. Daniel recovered fast. What is this, some kind of joke? No, sir. Dad stepped forward angrily. My son hasn't done anything. The agent ignored him. Sir, were you involved in submitting digital verification forms related to Commander Brooks's military records? Daniel laughed too loudly. I don't know anything about military forms. Interesting, Hale replied calmly, because your IP address appears on several encrypted submissions. Silence. Complete silence. I watched Daniel carefully. His hands were shaking. Tiny tremors. Fear again. Real fear. Dad looked between all of us helplessly. Daniel. My brother suddenly pointed toward me. She told me to handle paperwork. I stared at him in disbelief. What? You were never here. Somebody had to take care of things. Agent Hale's expression hardened slightly. Sir, falsifying federal military documentation carries significant criminal penalties. Dad finally exploded. This is ridiculous. He's her brother. The older agent beside Hale finally spoke for the first time. Sir, he said quietly, family fraud is one of the most common financial crimes against elderly Americans. That sentence hit my father like a slap. Because suddenly this wasn't just about us anymore. It was something uglier. More common. More real. Daniel looked trapped now. Cornered animals either collapse or attack. My brother chose attack. 2 days later, he filed formal accusations against me in county court, claiming I manipulated our mother financially using classified military influence. Linda read the complaint twice before muttering, well, your brother just made the worst mistake of his life. Because once Daniel dragged federal military records into open court, the Navy stopped treating this like a private family dispute. And somewhere behind closed doors, somebody prepared a sealed envelope with my name on it. By the morning of the hearing, the rain had finally arrived. A cold April rain. The kind that turns Norfolk streets silver before sunrise and makes old people complain about their knees over diner coffee. I stood alone beside the courthouse window watching water slide down the glass while adjusting the cuffs of my navy blue blazer. Not uniform, just civilian clothes. I hadn't worn dress whites in almost 8 months. Retirement still felt strange on my shoulders. You look calm, Linda said beside me. I'm trying. You succeeding? Not really. She smiled faintly. Good, nervous people stay sharp. The courthouse itself was old Virginia brick and polished wood built sometime back in the 1940s. You could smell old paper in the hallways, old money, old arguments. The kind of place where generations of families brought their worst moments. Divorces, custody fights, probate disputes, and now us. I spotted Dad sitting near the far end of the hallway with Daniel. Neither had noticed me yet. My father looked exhausted. He wore the same brown suit from Mom's funeral hanging looser on him now. Daniel sat beside him talking rapidly, leaning forward, performing confidence. Even from across the hallway I recognized the act. He was scared. Dad finally looked up and saw me. For a brief second something softened in his face. Then Daniel noticed me too. The softness disappeared immediately. Daniel stood first. Well, he called loudly enough for nearby people to hear look who finally showed up. Linda muttered under her breath. Charming. I walked toward them calmly. Morning, Dad. He nodded stiffly. Daniel folded his arms. You really brought lawyers into this. You filed the lawsuit. You forced me to. There it was again. Nothing was ever Daniel's fault. Not the missing funds, not the forged records, not the lies. Everything simply happened to him. Dad cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe we can still settle this quietly. I looked at him carefully. Did Daniel tell you about the federal investigation? Dad's eyes flickered toward his son. He said it's a misunderstanding. Of course he did. Dad. We're done discussing this, Daniel snapped suddenly. His voice echoed harder than he intended. Several people turned to look. Then I noticed something else. 2 men in dark suits standing near the courthouse entrance. Watching. Not casually. Professionally. Federal. Daniel noticed them too. The color drained from his face for half a second before returning. Linda leaned closer to me. They're here already. I kept my eyes forward. NCIS. Probably not just NCIS anymore. That sentence settled heavily inside my chest. Because once multiple federal agencies become involved, situations stop being private forever. The courtroom filled slowly after that. Mostly lawyers, clerks, a few curious locals, and older couples waiting for unrelated hearings. Norfolk courts always carried a strange mixture of boredom and tension. Lives changed there every day. Usually quietly. At 9 sharp, the bailiff called us to order. Judge Harold Bennett entered wearing half-moon reading glasses and an expression suggesting he was already tired of everybody in the room. We took our seats. Daniel sat across from me beside his attorney, sweating despite the cool temperature. Dad remained in the gallery directly behind him. The hearing began routinely enough. Inheritance dispute. Questions regarding estate transfers. Concerns about competency during signature authorization. Then Daniel's lawyer made a mistake. He tried turning the entire case toward my military record. Your Honor, he announced confidently, we believe the defendant has used exaggerated federal credentials to intimidate family members and influence estate matters. Linda immediately stood. Objection. But the judge waived for clarification. The attorney continued. We are prepared to show inconsistencies regarding Commander Brooks's classified service claims. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The line Daniel should never have crossed. The judge looked toward me. Commander Brooks. Before I could answer, Daniel suddenly stood up himself. You want to know the truth? He snapped loudly. His own attorney looked alarmed. Mr. Brooks. She's a fraud, Daniel shouted, pointing directly at me. She disappears for years pretending she's some war hero while the rest of us take care of the family. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. Dad looked horrified. But Daniel kept going. She lies about classified work because nobody can verify it. She's been manipulating everybody for decades. I remained perfectly still. That seemed to anger him even more. She's an imposter. The word cracked across the courtroom. Then everything changed. The rear doors opened quietly. A man entered wearing a dark federal raincoat beside a woman in navy dress whites. Not ordinary service dress. Investigative command. The room immediately shifted. People sensed authority before a single word was spoken. The woman approached the bench carrying a large sealed envelope stamped with federal markings. Judge Bennett frowned. What is this? The federal agent spoke calmly. Supplemental documentation requested under Federal Review Authority, Your Honor. Daniel's attorney stood abruptly. We object to— You'll sit down, the judge interrupted. The agent handed over the envelope. I watched Judge Bennett open it carefully. Page 1. His expression remained neutral. Page 2. His posture stiffened slightly. Page 3. Everything changed. The color drained from his face. He removed his glasses slowly and reread something. The courtroom had gone completely silent now. Even Daniel stopped breathing. Finally, the judge looked up. Not at me. At Daniel. Then he spoke 4 words. Put him in cuffs. Nobody moved at first, because nobody fully understood what they'd heard. Then the bailiff turned sharply. Sir, stand up. Daniel blinked wildly. What? Stand up now. This is insane, Daniel stammered. What's happening? 2 federal marshals entered immediately from the side doors. Dad rose halfway from his seat. Wait, he barked. What the hell is this? The judge's voice hardened. Mr. Daniel Brooks is being detained pending federal investigation involving fraud, identity falsification, unlawful access to military records, and financial exploitation connected to protected federal benefits. Dad looked physically unsteady. No, that can't be right. Daniel pointed toward me desperately. She told me to handle the paperwork. I finally spoke. No, Daniel, I trusted you to help our parents. The difference mattered. And for the first time in his life, my brother understood nobody could rescue him from it. The marshals cuffed him right there in court. Metal clicking against metal. Dad stared like the world beneath him had suddenly disappeared. Then Judge Bennett turned toward me again. His voice changed completely. Respectful now. Commander Brooks, why exactly was this court not informed of your protected operational status? The room fell silent again. I answered honestly. Because I was trying to protect my family. The judge studied me for several seconds. Then he glanced toward the federal agent. Is the documentation verified? Yes, Your Honor. He nodded slowly. Fully. Completely. Dad looked at me like he was seeing a stranger. Or maybe for the first time in his life seeing me clearly at all. Then he whispered the saddest words I've ever heard from another human being. Evelyn, what did you do all those years? I looked at my father quietly while federal officers led my brother from the courtroom. And the truth was, I wasn't sure how to answer that question anymore. After the courtroom hearing, I drove aimlessly for nearly an hour before realizing I'd crossed the bridge toward Portsmouth without remembering any of it. That happens sometimes after shock. Not dramatic shock like explosions or gunfire. Emotional shock. The kind that settles into your bones slowly after years of holding yourself together. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while I sat parked near the Elizabeth River, watching tugboats move through gray water. My brother had just been arrested. My father looked shattered. And somehow none of it felt victorious. That surprised me most. People think revenge feels triumphant when the moment finally comes. Like fireworks. Like justice descending from heaven. But sitting there alone in my car at 58 years old, all I felt was tired. Deep down tired. The kind carried by people who spent too long trying to earn love from folks who already decided not to give it. My phone rang around noon.